It was Voltaire who said, "Those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities." Well, we're now living in a time where a huge chunk of the global population seem to believe that wearing a face nappy or a face shield and quarantining the healthy and destroying the economy, putting millions out of work, not treating cancer patients, preventing dying people from having family at their bedside in their final hours, keeping humanity from each other with antisocial distancing, and treating children like this, and this, and this is somehow justified. These are absurdities. And the vast majority of people either fully believe in them, or at the very least, tacitly endorse them through a lack of resistance. As I drove to the dentist the other day for what I suspect will be my final dental appointment for a very long time, given that we're headed for a second and, no doubt, longer lockdown followed by a catastrophic economic and societal collapse, I saw a huge amount of people wearing masks outside in the rain. Wet muzzles on their face. They're wearing them in the rain. It's like breathing through a used dishcloth from the sink. Imagine the germs and the infections a person would get from breathing with a moist or saturated rag on their face. Imagine throwing out any common sense and intentionally doing this because you were just told to. I can't imagine the amount of sickness that masks will cause, and clearly neither can the mask wearers, who wouldn't dream of wearing an actual dishcloth on their face, but with sufficient amounts of fear and propaganda pumped into their brains for months on end, they've been convinced that to protect them from a virus with the same fatality rate as the flu, they believe it is justified to wear a face mask, rebreathing in their own CO2, compromising their immune systems, and even breathing through it when it's soaking wet, and thus increasing their chances of becoming actually sick. What can one say about the mindset of a populace that is comprised of docile, reprogrammable sheep with a herd mentality and no critical or rational thinking? That, I fear, may be a society that will permit tyranny and even atrocities because it lacks the ability to question media messaging, government mandates, and reflect on the nature of reality and their own behaviour. Moreover, a people who have outsourced their critical and reasoning ability to someone else will soon find that evil flourishes in a moral vacuum. Truly horrific outcomes become possible when the populace at large have been trained to place their unwavering trust in authority and to simply obey government mandates without question. On a related note, as Peter Hitchens has recently pointed out on Twitter, interesting early use of face muzzles at the lawless Guantanamo camp, extraordinarily similar to those now being forced on populations of formerly free nations. The aim appears to be dehumanization, forced submission, and possibly even to make people sick. In the name of the so-called greater good, almost anything can be justified. Oh, and on that subject, I recently saw this report by Simeon Burke.
So on Friday last week, NUIG students were informed of a new pledge they will need to sign if they want to return to college next month. Now this pledge, called the Community Promise, is very problematic. It completely undermines students' rights and freedoms. It compels us to share personal health data on an ongoing basis with the university, and in addition, it binds us under an obligation to change our behaviour in whatever way the university demands. Now there are four main problems with the Community Promise. In the first place, it's a form of compelled speech. The university is telling us we must sign it or we will be thrown out of university. That is an infringement on our rights to freedom of speech. In the second place, the promise is requiring us to commit to following guidelines no matter how they may change into the future. Now, this is a totally open-ended commitment, and it flies in the face of individual autonomy. It forces students to surrender the right to think for themselves. In the third place, the promise compels us to share personal health data on an ongoing basis with the university. It means that if you get a cough, if you get a cold, if you feel tired in a few weeks' time, you're going to have to share that information with the university, and if you're asked, get a COVID test and self-isolate. If you don't do that, you might be subjected to a disciplinary process. Finally, the Community Promise involves a pledge to change your behaviour whenever you're challenged by the university. That's irrespective of any view you might have to the wrongness or the rightness of your behaviour. You're committing to changing it, whatever the universities say. So this is extremely serious. Today I'm contacting and writing to the president of NUI Galway, Professor Ciarán O'Hogarty. I'm going to raise my concerns with him and register my objections. I'll be in touch with any updates. Thank you.
Moving on from that bit of dystopian collectivism, recently UK Health Secretary Matt Hancock has launched Operation Moonshot. It's a plan to test 4 million people every day within months to boost the faltering economy.
This article is from the Daily Mail.
The Health Secretary is said to be preparing what has been dubbed Operation Moonshot with the aim of increasing daily tests by around 12-fold by early next year. Currently, the NHS and private testing centres have a capacity of around 326,000, although because of the current level of infection, only around 190,000 are being carried out. A massive expansion of the testing regime is seen as a key requirement of easing lockdown measures further as the public continue to be wary of a return to workplaces. But the scale of the plan will raise some eyebrows after Mr. Hancock's struggles throughout the pandemic to dramatically up the testing rate. His test and trace scheme, run by Tory peer Baroness Harding, has also come in for major criticism. The paper reported that he was seeking a testing scheme that could identify those without symptoms, who are often missed by current regimes. Last week, he promised a widespread screening program by Christmas to give the country back its freedom. Once again, everything is always on the government's terms. It's as though the public are to be treated forever like children. Is that the new normal? When people behave and comply to whatever the government demands, then perhaps people's freedoms will be given back to them. Freedoms which, in truth, the government never had the right to take away in the first place because the people are sovereign and their freedoms are inalienable. But crank the fear of death up sufficiently for long enough, and the public will become seduced into sacrificing more of their freedoms for so-called security and safety from the state. Ministers are confident that faster tests providing results in as little as 10 minutes can be used to fight any resurgence of COVID-19 this winter. What's so hard to believe is how anyone can take this case-demic seriously. The PCR testing is useless and appears to be simply finding generic coronaviruses that everyone has. So what I suspect is going to happen is the following. More localized lockdowns will take place across the world in a manner similar to how we've been seeing them in the UK, Ireland and Australia. Towns and cities will be shut down because of suspected surges in cases, along with, of course, meat processing factories and so forth. I also predict that the reopening of schools is designed to serve as a false dawn. As more and more children are tested, the government, experts and the media will wax on and on about surges, clusters, and worrying and concerning outbreaks in schools. Children testing positive for coronavirus during the Northern Hemisphere winter, with children getting sick from the usual winter bugs, including actual colds and flus. This will likely send the public into panic about COVID mutating to now affect children. You can see where this narrative will go. With children testing positive, governments will claim that entire households must be sources of infection and will need quarantining because the children will either infect their parents and elderly relatives, or they were infected by their parents and their elderly relatives. So this will mean that once a child tests positive, mandatory testing programs will potentially be rolled out for everyone in the child's household. If New Zealand's precedent is anything to go by, quarantining for suspected infected persons may take place in quarantine facilities.
As part of our overall national response to this new outbreak, I am now directing medical officers of health that all cases, confirmed cases, are to be managed in a quarantine facility. Now, this is different to how positive cases were managed when we were last at levels 4 and indeed 3, and shows how serious we are about limiting any risk of ongoing transmission, even in self-isolation and including to others in the household. This will apply to any cases and also close family members who might be at risk as appropriate. A reminder, these facilities have been set up specifically and have excellent processes and resources in place to look after people with COVID-19, including health staff on site at all times, and it will help us avoid any further inadvertent spread into the community as part of our overall response.
Make no mistake, The summer was just a reprieve from the lockdown. And it was only a partial reprieve, of course. Pubs never fully reopened, and we still have to make do with all of this ridiculous Orwellian social distancing. The second lockdown appears to be well and truly on its way. And if the globalists are to bring humanity to its knees, such that people will beg for the vaccine as the heralded solution, then the second lockdown will have to be much more draconian than the first one. Here in Ireland, Minister for Health Stephen Donnelly has recently warned us, pandemic is close to having us lock down the country again. And we already have 3 counties in lockdown. Despite us now living in a case-demic and not an actual pandemic.
That's assuming that a more serious virus doesn't suddenly come out of nowhere.
Taiwan, New Zealand, Australia, they took their experience and actually prepared, and so they moved a lot faster. So we, we'll have to prepare for the next one. That, I'd say is will get attention this time. Mm-hmm. The idea of a bioterrorist attack is kind of the nightmare scenario because they're a pathogen with a high death rate would be picked. Now, the good news is, I'm not trying to depress you, it's tough enough right now. Most of the work we're going to do to be ready for pandemic 2, I call this pandemic 1, most of the work we'll do to be ready for that are also the things we need to do to minimize the threat of bioterrorism. So we, we'll have to prepare for the next one. That, I'd say is will get attention this time. Mm-hmm. So we, we'll have to prepare for the next one. That, I'd say is will get attention this time. Mm-hmm. That, I'd say is will get attention this time. Mm-hmm. That, I'd say is will get attention this time. Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, I can only speculate on how the second lockdown may be made worse than the first one, and of course, you should take my speculation with a pinch of salt. But if we're starting from the position of understanding that Agenda 21 is in full swing here, and the goal is depopulation, then we must be willing to consider all possible extreme scenarios. We know that food shortages are on the way. We know that they've previously cancelled Easter. Why wouldn't they try to cancel Christmas as well? And I fully expect plenty of heartwarming propaganda advertisements about how we can't get close to relatives this Christmas and how we'll all have to cocoon alone in our homes. And we'll see people with Christmas cracker party hats on talking over Skype and Zoom while having their Christmas dinner. Grandchildren waving at grandma and granddad on the iPad or the iPhone. The usual bullshit. I can imagine seeing articles about how social distanced Christmas is actually better than normal Christmas because oftentimes close quarters with family, extended family and relatives during the festive season can be sometimes a bit of a drag after a while and lead to arguments and stress. So maybe communicating over the internet is better. The usual way that the media try to sell a nightmare world as a positive thing.
By the way, on the subject of the United Nations Agenda 21 and Agenda 2030, let's talk about the UN for a moment. This article is from news.un.org. Virtual concert unites Pacific with the world in battling COVID-19. So it says the final act. The concert closed with a moving performance of a song called We Will Rise, written about the coronavirus pandemic in the Pacific and performed by Pacifica Voices and the international school Suva. Sung primarily by children and youth, the heartwarming lyrics concluded on a note of hope. Listen to this. Around the world, we're closing borders. COVID-19 on the rise. A new world order behind closed doors. The storm will pass. We will survive. We will rise. We will rise again. Our isles will rise again. We will rise again. Our world will rise again. The mask really is coming off as they get closer and closer to their end goal of a new world order. They're going to get more brazen and upfront about it, and everyone who was previously called a tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist will suddenly not be considered quite so crazy after all. The Agenda 2030 Sustainable Development Goals target, as part of Agenda 21, is to basically control, monitor, and reduce human movement and behaviour. And part of that is to keep us hemmed in, which is why they tried to get us used to 2 and 5 kilometre distances from our homes during the lockdown. We'll be told this is all part of reducing our carbon emissions for climate change and fighting bioterrorism and constant threats posed by pandemics. This is the new normal future that they want to create. It's all for our safety and the safety of the environment, don't you know? So we're expected to be living in urban and city dwellings, high-density housing, and constantly surveilled and controlled via a vast social credit system. Real-world human interactions are to be reduced as much as possible, which is why they've been getting us used to that, of course, with social distancing. And the outside world, with all of its constant security checkpoints, invasive government overreach, annoying social distancing, and onerous rules and regulations, is to be made an unpleasant place to be for long periods of time. This is already the case in some places in China, as I've previously reported. Have you seen this Wall Street Journal video from 2017? It sounds like the blueprint of where they want us to go in the West. In this Chinese city, Xinjiang, there's heavy policing everywhere, like a war zone. Constant government surveillance of the populace, facial recognition, constant police checkpoints. It's basically hell. Everyone is on the system. Everyone is tracked all the time. Every move you make is monitored in this city, and you're checked multiple times per day.
To be in Xinjiang means being checked every day, multiple times a day. When you go to a market, when you drive a car, when you take a train, even your smartphone is checked.
But what I found most striking was what this wine store owner said. He says, "It is really cumbersome. Nobody wants to do anything anymore. The police check my ID so many times, I don't want to do shopping anymore." And that's very interesting because this is how more and more people in the West are starting to feel under social distancing rules. Now, obviously, China is a good deal further down the road, but not much worse at this point. The social distancing, temperature checks, obsessive hand sanitizing, queuing all the time to get into buildings, app tracking, that's all happening more and more in public venues in Western cities. And it makes the prospect of going outside very undesirable indeed. The Chinese model of tighter top-down control and totalitarianism is the model that is now being rolled out across the world as part of the new abnormal. Human beings are supposed to live atomized lives in fear of each other and trusting only the government. And with the introduction of a cashless society and digital currencies, well, they will have control of all of our transactions as well. Back in June, the UN talked about how COVID-19 could cause the worst food crisis in 50 years. Here's a Guardian article on this. The world stands on the brink of a food crisis, worse than any seen for at least 50 years, the UN has warned, as it urged governments to act swiftly to avoid disaster. Better social protections for poor people are urgently needed, as the looming recession following the coronavirus pandemic may put basic nutrition beyond their reach, the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres said on Tuesday. Unless immediate action is taken, it is increasingly clear that there is an impending global food emergency that could have long-term impacts on hundreds of millions of children and adults, he said. We need to act now to avoid the worst impacts of our efforts to control the pandemic. Although harvests of staple crops are holding up, and the export bans and protectionism that experts feared have so far been largely avoided, the worst of the impacts of the pandemic and ensuing recession are yet to be felt. Guterres warned, even in countries with abundant food, we see risks of disruption in the food supply chain. About 50 million people risk falling into extreme poverty this year owing to the pandemic. But the long-term effects will be even worse as poor nutrition in childhood causes lifelong suffering. Already 1 in 5 children around the world are stunted in their growth by the age of 5, and millions more are likely to suffer the same fate if poverty rates soar. As you know, even in Western nations, we've seen examples of food processing and meat plants and factories being closed because of so-called alleged outbreaks of COVID, which again is to say that employees in those workplaces are simply testing positive for more generic coronaviruses and may in fact be entirely healthy with no symptoms. Strange how large Amazon warehouses don't get closed for the same reason. I guess it's the same kind of logic that allowed abortion clinics to remain open, but dentists to be closed during the lockdown. Ultimately, that should tell you everything that you need to know. The manufactured food shortages are yet another crisis for us to deal with, and of course, he who controls the food supply controls the people. I have to be honest, it looks like they're going to throw the entire kitchen sink at us in order to make us comply and take the vaccine. All roads seem to be leading there, and they also want us to accept a digital identification system without which we won't be able to live a normal life, attend public gatherings, travel or enter shops and buy food, etc. The future under the New World Order is simply put communist enslavement achieved through a global population control network. I'm also concerned that the globalists may have a backup plan, a countermeasure to rising citizen resistance. Could that backup plan be another virus, a worse virus, for example? It's possible, but I don't see why they'd do that. It's too big a risk, and the globalists will only do what they need to do. Think about it. They don't need to take the risk of losing control of a deadly virus like Ebola or something. Their goal seems to be to introduce the vaccine and to vaccinate 7 billion people. MERS and SARS, being precursors to COVID-19, just didn't get the job done, and neither did the climate change alarmism. But COVID hysteria and the alignment of the mainstream media and governments around the world has been very successful. So I think as part of the great economic reset, the plan is to simply get as many people as possible to fall into abject poverty and make people hungry. This makes more and more people dependent on the government and puts them into state welfare programs. And with that will come desperation for any so-called solution to lift people out of that situation. The globalists have a long game here in mind, and that includes universal basic income for all. So what can we do? Well, we've made a start with the beginnings of a pushback and with managing to reach a lot of people with the truth. This has begun to manifest in a slow burn awakening, with protests in many major cities worldwide and some planned for this weekend. Credit to everyone in the alternative media truth movement and to patriots and freedom lovers everywhere, for people who make the content, to the doctors and professors speaking out, and to everyone for sharing videos, blog posts, articles, podcasts, etc., any material that helps to debunk the corona scam. At the same time, I don't want to oversell what we've achieved because it's fair to say that we haven't reached the majority of people, and the globalists continue with their plans at pace, and they use our politicians and governments like pawns obeying their every order without question. There's a lot more people to be reached, and I don't know how many more we will be able to reach by the time we get to the vaccination situation. Some people don't see the point of street protests, and I can see their frustration. Our politicians have sold us out after all, and our nations are little more than vassal zombie states, puppet governments being manipulated and controlled by the globalist entities and international banking cartels. Our governments, who are little more than local enforcers of the New World Order, may not come to their senses. At the same time, our politicians need to realize that they're playing a very high-stakes game here. If the trick is ultimately figured out and they get rumbled by the public, they will be the ones left carrying the can of responsibility for this fiasco. So, what can street protests achieve? Some people write them off because they look like the public begging for their rights back from the government, but I don't believe that's correct. Protests give exposure to a cause, and they also give courage and hope to those in the general public who have kept silent but secretly know something is not right. They communicate to them, no, you're not crazy, you're not the only one who thinks that way, there's a lot more people who think just like you. They also help people to build networks, which is probably the most important thing. And from this, we can begin to formulate plans to develop parallel societies outside of the New World Order. We're going to need to bring the system to a grinding halt through mass civil disobedience and peaceful non-compliance. The large follow-up protest scheduled for this weekend in Berlin was cancelled by the German government. The absolute arrogance that the government believes it can cancel a peaceful public protest against itself. Removing people's right to freely assemble is an alarming and dangerous precedent to set. Of course, it's not the first time that's happened in Germany. I hope even more people attend in defiance of these orders. Ultimately, the globalists want what is effectively a global communist revolution, but I believe they may be escalating this takeover too quickly for it to be totally successful and trying to achieve in several months what would normally take years. Even in that almost iconic article from 2016 from the World Economic Forum, "Welcome to 2030, I own nothing, have no privacy, and life has never been better," the article talks about the future of humanity living in smart cities, constantly surveilled, tracked and monitored, with no privacy, freedom, or private property rights. But it also mentions those who built a parallel society outside of the cities and who opted to live off the grid. The article reads, "My biggest concern is all the people who do not live in our city, those we lost on the way, those who decided that it became too much, all this technology, those who felt obsolete and useless when robots and AI took over big parts of our jobs, those who got upset with the political system and turned against it. They live different kind of lives outside the city. Some have formed little self-supplying communities. Others just stayed in the empty and abandoned houses in small 19th century villages. Once in a while I get annoyed about the fact that I have no real privacy, nowhere I can go and not be registered. I know that somewhere everything I do, think, and dream of is recorded. I just hope that nobody will use it against me. Keep in mind, that's the kind of world that the globalists want to create for humanity." Likewise, in the lockstep Rockefeller scenario from 2010, which I've read many times now, which is again about the world of tighter top-down control and government overreach after a major pandemic, it concludes by talking about how people were weary of so much top-down control and letting leaders and authorities make choices for them. Even those who liked the greater stability and predictability of this world began to grow uncomfortable and constrained by so many tight rules and by the strictness of national boundaries. The feeling lingered that sooner or later something would inevitably upset the neat order that the world's governments had worked so hard to establish. Perhaps even the globalists themselves realized that their delicate house of cards would eventually come crashing down, that they aren't completely confident that they can pull off this new world order. One of their strategies is to try to make us believe that we've lost already, that we're doomed no matter what we do, that the struggle is futile, and yet they themselves are the ones who communicate their doubts and insecurities about their own ability to fully control us and achieve their grand master plan. The fact that the media propaganda around COVID-19 has to be so continuously reinforced and so scary and so pervasive, and the fact that censorship is rising against anybody who speaks against the narrative, just goes to show that they too have their doubts that they can win this. One thing we can count on: when the first lockdown was called, there was near universal support for it. But things have certainly changed now. There is now a growing and increasingly vocal movement against a second lockdown, and it's global. The most important thing to do is to not be afraid. It may sound easier said than done, but keeping control of your fears is, at least in the beginning, the most powerful weapon that you have. Remember that line from the film Dune: "I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer." There will be intimidation, more heavy-handed policing, draconian government measures, and terrifying media propaganda. Through it all, we must remain resolute, and to learn to detach ourselves from the negative and unproductive emotions that they wish to elicit within us. Fear is meant to paralyze you, just as it has paralyzed a huge chunk of the population, including those parents now sending their children back to schools under abusive social distancing rules. Heroism requires the people to conquer their fears and to rediscover their courage. It is only by doing so that good can finally overcome evil.